Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a new episode of the Ink and Bites podcast. No, I haven't forgot about the show. I haven't forgotten that it existed. I just haven't had the time to really sit down and do it. Just like I haven't written my book in a very long time, and I really need to get back to that eventually. I actually find myself thinking about the show quite often and thinking about if I have time to do an episode, do I have the energy to do an episode, and do I have a topic that I want to talk about? And today, I finally have a topic that I want to talk about, and this topic you can read on my blog right now at the-world-builder.com if you want some spoilers and a more comprehensive, more clear-minded discussion about what we're going to talk about, because when I record these podcasts, I find that I tend to ramble and lose sight of some of the things I want to mention. So if you want a complete look at what I'm going to be talking about today in the next few minutes, feel free to check that out. But it's good to be here. I'm so sorry to have kept you waiting, but without further ado, let's jump in. We all like to read, right? Or I should say, a lot of us like to read, to open up a book, get lost in its captivating story, whether that be fantasy, fiction, science fiction, and I guess you can say that all falls under fiction as a genre, and they're all subgenres, but either way, or even nonfiction, there's some really good nonfiction out there. But reading is a way of escaping into a new world, similar to how video games are to a lot of us, including me. And a lot of books have well built out storylines, worlds, characters, plots, setting, all of the things that make a story really good. We have things like all of Brandon Sanderson's books with this insane multiverse and different storylines and themes all feeding this one universe that the fans are very crazy, or I should say very passionate about. We have things like Lord of the Rings that have captivated and transformed the film industry and more or less the fantasy genre forever. And we have things like The Witcher that has also done the same thing, but in slightly different ways. And the audiences of these pieces of fiction, I am in particular very deep in the fandom of The Witcher stuff and Lord of the Rings stuff, loved their worlds and the settings that those authors have set up and have played around and have built. And to step away from the rules that were already defined by the original author is oftentimes seen as an insult or a slight or just plain wrong. And I kind of want to look at that phenomenon, this purist mindset, as I like to call it, and think about if it hinders creativity and if it makes the new creators of an adaptation or a TV series or movie make bad choices because they're afraid of the fan backlash. And there's a lot of examples of this, too many to talk about. But we're going to be looking at two in particular that really are the antithesis of this. One of them being a good example of when fans were justified in their outrage and led to show cancellations and spin-off cancellations, and pretty much the entire project as a whole being tossed away because it wasn't worth it. And the other example that I'm really curious to be talking about is where the audience, or I should say the hardcore fan base, is less justified, or there's less passion, or there's less reasons, I should say, to be aggravated at the adaptation creators. And I'm not saying that anybody in this case is wrong. This is merely just me giving my observation on these two examples and how I feel about this purist mindset as a whole, just to be a little bit informative and kind of explore, does this stuff actually hinder creativity? And these two examples, to put a name on them, is the Witcher franchise and the Netflix adaptation, and Tolkien's the Lord of the Rings and the current Rings of Power adaptation on Amazon Prime. Let's first start with the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski, and I apologize if I butchered that name. It's a Russian name, and I am notoriously not good at pronunciating names. So, the Witcher series originally was a series of books, 8 fantasy novels, and 15 short stories. And these stories revolve around the Witcher, Geralt of Rivia. And over the course of years, these books have spawned video games by the very popular gaming studio, CD Projekt Red. And over the course of years that these have been out in the world, has pretty much fully fleshed out the world of the Witcher. The main story that he was writing has been pretty much concluded, I believe. I haven't finished reading it myself. I'm only on like book 5 or 6. And there was kind of a roadmap built here. And because of the popularity of the book series and the games and the COVID era, a little bit before the COVID era, 2019, 2018, Netflix approached Andrzej and purchased, or made a deal, I should say, to make the 8-book series into a Netflix adaptation. Great. Rejoice. Woo! That's as excited as I can get, guys. Everybody was clapping. The fans were excited. I was excited. For one, the lead star was Henry Cavill, someone who is a very big fan of the Witcher series, has played the games, and I believe read the books. And literally, there couldn't have been a better Geralt that is casted. And when the first season came out, it was very mixed. The first season adapted the prologue book, Last Wish, I believe it was called, and as well as the first book of the main series. And because of the task at hand, it was going to be really messy. There's a lot of time jumps in the first one in particular, and it kind of was met with mixed reviews. And then the second season came out, and then the third season, and it was all kind of just really bad. And everybody was not happy with it. Matter of fact, the biggest thing that happened was Henry left after just 3 seasons of the show because of various disagreements with the writers and for an injury sustained. And he lost the passion for it because it was clear that the source material of the books and just everything that was already built out was being completely disregarded in order to build this new version of The Witcher to fit the era, I should say. I don't like the word woke, so I'm not using it because I don't think it was woke like everybody always likes to throw around. I just think that the clear, blatant disregard to the world that was built before them and already set up to basically be the next Game of Thrones if they really wanted it to be, that aggravated people the most. But there were a lot of things that happened in particular that stoked the purist debate. And honestly, I feel like this purist mindset war that has been raging over every adaptation since The Witcher's inception kind of spawned here. I believe the debates always happened. They were really more or less combined into the world of Reddit and private circles or very close-knit circles of fans. I don't really think many purist debates over adaptations really reached the mainstream until The Witcher, and then that bled over to the Rings of Power. But a lot of things in The Witcher that the writers of Netflix changed, or I should say maybe the bigger bosses of Netflix made the writers change, are things such as one of the main protagonists in the novel, Yennefer, being changed into this motherly figure to another main character and main driving plot thread of the novels, Ciri, changing her from a mother figure to Ciri into a antagonistic role in the first 2 seasons, or the first season or the second season, and a little bit of the third, which was pretty much, and spoiler warning out there now, if you haven't watched the adaptations and for some reason you do, I recommend doing it now because it's pretty much canceled after this next season. Selling Ciri to a evil witch in order to regain her power at the time, that did not happen in the novels, and changing a beloved protagonist into a very rushed antagonist felt really bad. And that was just one of the many examples. I'll touch on a few others very briefly here. Another character called Fringilla was significantly expanded upon in the adaptation, whereas she had a very minimal role in the novels, and here in the Netflix series has been morphed to take on this political antagonistic role as well, and it really felt like a metaphor for the current political era that we're in, but putting it into a fantasy setting, which was kind of gross. This is where some people argue that the show was turned into a message to push politics, which I could understand. And that also stoked this idea of why did you disregard the source material so haphazardly. There was also, instead of characters just being changed, there were also characters that were just fabricated for the adaptation that never existed in the novels. And you can only imagine how aggravated book purists were when they were seeing characters such as Dara, who was literally an elf character that was introduced to be Ciri's friend in order to give some more early growth for the character. It made Ciri have less individuality, though, and so on and so forth. We're not doing a deep dive here, just kind of giving the blanket reasons, because I can rant if I really wanted to. But nonetheless, this really kind of blew up in the show writers' faces, and they had to basically go back and try to scrub their mistakes from the third season, which led the third season to feel like a nothing soup, because they spent most of the time going back and fixing what they did in order to set up for the rest of the series, instead of actually progressing any plot. So it just wasn't a really good feeling. All of this led to the show being canceled because of low numbers, not enough money being brought in from the low numbers. The only good thing that really came out of Netflix's tenure in adapting The Witcher are the 2 animated shorts that came of it. One of them is not out yet, but just assuming it, because it's made, I believe, by the same studio, it's going to be good. The first one was the Vesemir prologue showing how he became the leader of Kaer Morhen, and the second one is going to be a animated short about Geralt fighting sirens. And this is a plotline that is kind of invented as well. It was a minor plot point in one of the short stories that Geralt is in, but it's that short story is being expanded into a movie. So those red flags are still kind of there, and the hardcore fan base is already like boycotting it and preparing to review bomb it because it's taking creative liberties that the fans feel like shouldn't exist. And let's talk about that. Now that we went over The Witcher and how rightly aggravated people are, creative liberty is something that every writer has to take when they're adapting a source material, because there's going to be blind spots that won't make sense in visual media that are going to have to be added in order to keep continuity. Unfortunately, the creative liberties that were taken in the term of The Witcher show didn't really hit the way that I'm assuming they were supposed to. They came off as bad, not good creative choices. From making Yennefer a antagonist, from inventing characters, which would have been fine if those characters were implemented better and didn't really hinder the plot. But creative liberties are the magic of adaptations if they're done well. And when these liberties are taken and new things are added that enrich the source material and make the original story better, that's when I think this idea of the purist mindset has no place to be, because we all love our favorite stories. I love Lord of the Rings. I always want Lord of the Rings to be better. More Lord of the Rings is great, and more good Lord of the Rings is fantastic. Not bad Lord of the Rings like the Gollum game. We don't talk about the Gollum game. But whereas the Witcher series did very bad at adapting the source material, basically not even reading it. There have been many reports that the writers of the show never even read the books. The Lord of the Rings writers and the creative liberties taken there, and the interpretations that were derived by the writers' reading of the Silmarillion, actually, as a whole, I argue, makes the world of Lord of the Rings feel better. Now let's talk about that next. Before we really get into that, I just want to set the record straight on my experience with Lord of the Rings, so you don't think I'm just a random kind of spewing my opinions that are uninformed. I went to school and studied Tolkien as part of my degree for English and creative writing. I've spent countless hours going through the novel, writing academia surrounding it, and going through very extensive projects surrounded by other Lord of the Rings and Tolkien fanatics. I have been kind of forged in this arena of Tolkien. Before that class, I had no idea about Lord of the Rings. I always wanted to read it. And then those experiences in my time studying him really expanded my understanding. So going into this, just know that I have a lot of experience in the material here, and I'm not just a random guy on the internet screaming why I think purists need to shut up. It's informed, I promise. But Lord of the Rings and Rings of Power, or any adaptation after Peter Jackson, is in a very particular situation. For one, you have the beloved book series starting with The Hobbit by Tolkien himself, by the man himself, that are adored and basically held on an altar. And then you have Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings movies, which are undoubtedly some of the best film we've ever gotten, and I don't think we'll ever see something as good as that trilogy ever again. I just don't think we're in a climate, or will ever be in a climate again, where we can capture the energy that movie created. And everything after that is like climbing a mountain. Every time you want to go and do something in Lord of the Rings, you have to be like, can I do better than Tolkien? Can I do right by Tolkien? Can I do right by Peter Jackson and his films? Because you're kind of standing on a foundation of gold. And if you are anything under polished diamond and gold, you will be looked at as a mistake. That's why the Gollum games did bad. That was copper of the worst quality. So, the Rings of Power or the Lord of the Rings of Power, fun title to say, is based on the Silmarillion. I'm going to be butchering that wrong. I was never able to pronounce it right, even in class. It was a running joke. And what is the Silmarillion? Well, it is a collection of short stories that tell the founding of Middle-earth in the First and Second Age and touch on a lot of things that are deep in Tolkien lore. The creation of elves, the Valar, the Vanar, the wizards, so on and so forth. Sauron, Morgoth, the Silmarils, all of the stuff that basically led to everything that happened in Lord of the Rings and onwards. These, like I said, are a collection of short stories, and unfortunately, before the book was ultimately completed, or the collection of short stories were ultimately completed, Tolkien passed away, leading to one of his family members to take up the pen and finish the book. And that's what we have for purchase today. A collection of short stories that Tolkien half finished and their family member had to finish for them. Inherently, this leads to a large amount of gray zone and a large amount of open interpretation because none of the stuff in the Silmarillion is a complete story. They are short stories that, by definition of short stories, are full narratives. They have all of the things to be there: rising action, character, and conclusions, and leaving the threads to the stories that come after it. But because of the nature of it, it's an collection of short stories. There's a lot of room for creative liberty, and I said it already, interpretation. And the Tolkien family is very famous for being very tight with the liberties or the access that they give to people who want to make content or adaptations to parts of the lore. They're very strict with giving access to that stuff. So when Amazon came over and managed to get access to the Silmarillion, they already have a upwards battle to deal with. One, the Tolkien family, which has been stated by many people on production that are working very closely with how the show is being developed. And also, you're dealing with a lot of gray zone and a lot of room for the interpretation of the writers to add things and do things differently, because not everything is explained in the Silmarillion. If Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power was described exactly how it was in the Silmarillion, every episode would be its own story and nothing would feel completed, because that's not how it was written. So with that in mind, when the first season came out, a lot of people freaking loved it. It was great, but there was a very loud minority of people that took to Reddit and started to scream, Adar never existed, Halbrand's bullshit, this, that, and the other thing. Just saying that it's not faithful to the source material, and it pains me because it's so good. Now, remember when I was talking about creative liberties done poorly in The Witcher? The creative liberties done in this show are very good. They all stay as true as they can to the content and the lore already developed by the people that came before them. And it rewards you for knowing the lore. They want you to come into Rings of Power knowing a lot about Tolkien. That is clear as day, especially in the second season. Again, spoiler warning here, where we see the sword Narsil before it became the sword shattered in three pieces, the white flame, Isildur's sword. It rewards you for knowing that. When the queen says, "This is Narsil," or however she said it, I screamed, quite frankly. And while characters introduced into The Witcher felt butchered, rushed, and kind of placeless, that they were there just to exist, characters that were fabricated for the Rings of Power feel like they belonged there in the first place. It feels like they somehow made a time machine, went back and talked to Tolkien and be like, this is what I would do. Now, I'm sure there's going to be some people that go, this guy's crazy. I cannot believe he just said that. How can you assume Tolkien would like what Rings of Power are doing? Just saying, it feels right. The character Adar, for example, is a character completely fabricated for the production of this show, and it feels right at home. And it is a genuinely strong character that makes you feel bad because, to be honest, if people just went with Adar, the Lord of the Rings would never happen because there probably would have been peace. But it was a well-developed character. They're there for a reason. They set up other threads and they bring forward the story. Seeing the creation of the rings is also great, and there's a lot of creative liberties there. Sauron's relationship with Celebrimbor, while we know the base relationship in the Silmarillion, it was awesome to see how this is brought forth into a visual form. So, there's a lot of care taken into the making of the Rings of Power, whereas there really wasn't that much in The Witcher, whereas nobody really, from our knowledge, the public's knowledge, no one bothered to read the Witcher books on the writing team. With the Rings of Power stuff, the show writers, the producers work hand in hand with the Tolkien family in order to stay faithful to the source material as much as they can. And I genuinely do not believe there would have been able to be a normal adaptation that is faithful 1,000,000% to the Silmarillion. And to that point, I want to close out with this little thought experiment. Would anything even be good if it followed the source material religiously and didn't invite creative decisions from the writers? Literally word for word. If you want faithful adaptations of stuff, go watch plays where they literally read everything word for word. I've been to a few Shakespeare plays and they're great. That doesn't translate very well into TV shows or film. You can't have an actor read line from line what their character says in the book. It just won't work. Those two mediums do not intermingle well. Things have to be changed. Flow has to be changed. Story beats have to be changed to fit a visual format. The last ride of the Rohirrim is a great example of that. It feels significantly more intense in the film because of what you're able to do with film over the written word. It's still really good in the actual book, but it doesn't give off the same intense feeling it does as the king is tapping his swords against all of his soldiers' spears as they're staring down at the White City and it being besieged and destroyed. The book does not give off the same feeling. So there are creative liberties that you have to take when adapting stories like this. And I'm going to beat the dead horse here. The Silmarillion wasn't a completed novel, and this is something I see people miss all of the time when they're sitting there screaming about being huge Tolkien fans and how sacrilegious the Rings of Power are. It's not a completed work. It's a collection of short stories with very large gaps in between each one, with characters that appear and disappear at random. It is a very, I don't want to say jumbled mess to be like offensive to Tolkien's work, but it is not a normal completed story like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were. So saying that The Rings of Power is a bad show because it's not faithful to the source material is kind of saying if you're making an adaptation, you're not allowed to be creative. And I think that's a dangerous thing to think, because without interpretation, without freedom of decisions on the source material in order to make the show fit a new media, no adaptation is really going to be good. That's kind of what I want you to think about. Decisions have to be made that will diverge from what has already been written, and that isn't always a bad thing. For The Witcher, it was, because it was done rushed without any actual information on the writer's side, because they didn't even look at the source material. But it was done very well with Rings of Power because the writers are informed, they're working really close with Tolkien's family, and they're doing it for the fans. And it's very clear with the story and how it's going. And the showrunners themselves have basically said they are huge fans of Tolkien's work. I say all of this because it pains me that people want such a fantastic show to be canceled, but thankfully, and this is the only time I'll say this, it's Jeff Bezos's pet project, so I'm thankful for that. And that is the only time I'll ever give praise to a billionaire. So the chances of it being canceled are very low, and I hope I didn't jinx it, because it would be a crime not to see the rest of this show play out. Because once it's done, we can do what we always wanted to do as Tolkien fans. We can start watching from the Rings of Power, then go to The Hobbit. And if you do enjoy the Hobbit movies, you're a very strong-willed person. I don't hate the Hobbit movies, but I also feel like it should have been 2 movies instead of 3, but I digress. You can go from The Hobbit then to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the extended edition if you want to be even more crazy and spend more time in there. We'll be able to have a closed loop on the Tolkien visual adaptations, I guess I can say. You can watch it straight through. You'll be able to see the Second Age, the finishing of the Second Age, the dawn of the Third Age, the Hobbit, and then the end of the Third Age into the Age of Men. And I don't know if they're going to do anything that takes place after Lord of the Rings. To be honest, that would be a significantly harder sell, because there's nothing really written for after Lord of the Rings besides, like, again, some short tidbits. That one would be interesting, but I feel like that's an even more uphill climb, because you're diverging completely away from the written material and basically coming up with your own Tolkien canon at that point. And if people are mad about Rings of Power, I don't even want to imagine how mad this people would be over a post Lord of the Rings series. We actually do have 2 films coming out. If this is still speculation, but one of them I believe is pretty much all but confirmed, where it's going to be The Search for Gollum, and Gandalf, and I don't know who else would be in that, looking for Gollum during the time gap in the first movie where Gandalf went to go find more information about the ring. That's going to be interesting. We'll see how that does. But nothing's really planned to ever talk about what happens after the end of The Return of the King, and I think that's probably where we'll be. So again, once Rings of Power is done, we'll be able to watch everything from start to finish, and that's freaking awesome. More Lord of the Rings in 2024, and good Lord of the Rings is a bonus. And I truly hope that in the future, this debate of the purist mindset of staying faithful kind of turns into a less argumentative and more conversational debate, instead of this thing where shows are canceled and things are bad. It's not healthy. Creativity spawns a lot of really good things, and creativity can also do things like what happened to The Witcher. But I digress. Again, if you want a more comprehensive, less rambly conversation and deep dive where I pull in some sources and I really explain how I feel in this debate of does being purist hinder creativity, you can find a really good blog. It's probably my favorite at the-world-builder.com, titled The Purist Mindset, Does It Hinder Creativity in Good Novel Adaptations? And with that said, thank you so much for hanging out with me today on this episode of Ink Bites, where I finally kind of lead into the ink part of the name and talk about some novel stuff. And I'll see you again soon. And again, no, I haven't forgot about the show, I promise. Thanks for hanging out. Love ya. Be safe out there. Adios.